Alright, so we're going to be talking about population and consumption this week. So this lecture is really just a bit of an introduction. After this lecture there will be a few YouTube clips for you to watch that really build upon the concepts that we're talking about here today. So this lecture is really just to introduce you to the idea of population and consumption. So the key points that we'll be looking at today is obviously sustainability, population, population growth, and also consumption. So, sustainability, this isn't a new concept. You would have heard about it in previous weeks in EHI. And clearly, sustainability, one of the greatest impacts on that is population. So, really, how sustainable is the population? So really the critical question here is how big can a population be for us to live sustainably? The other essential fact is how much can we consume? So how many of us are there, and how much or how much resources of the earth are we using? So really we're going to be looking at that today. And how many people can the world sustain, and at what consumption? So that's really the key. After this week's content of this introduction lecture and a couple of the other videos and the discussion, that's what we really want you to get out of this. So I'm not going to go too much over sustainability. By now you should have a general understanding of what it is. And then we refer back to looking at the basic principles of sustainability, and this is from Talbot and Verenda, so it shouldn't be new to you. I guess the information here that's really applicable to population consumption is the two really is the intergenerational equity. So that's really fairness and justice to the future generations. So what we as a current generation, we have a responsibility to maintain for future generations and protect the environment for these future generations. So making sure what we're doing now is going to be sustainable, that there will be, a world to live in for future generations. And then the other key principle of basic principle of sustainability that's relevant here is this biodiversity conservation. So really protecting those ecosystems. So that really has a big relationship with the population and consumption and how much we're consuming, and making sure that we're not depleting ecosystem, which is then obviously results in a loss of biodiversity. Alright, so in the first couple of weeks of EHI, you would have looked at a couple of different frameworks or declarations. So one of them might have been this Rio Declaration on the environment and development, and that was obviously in a UN conference on environment and development, and they met in Rio in 1992. And really I think the important thing, and you would have noticed this when we were talking about the Ottawa Charter as well in previous weeks, is how current, even though these are a little bit older declarations, this was 92, the Ottawa Charter was 1986, these principles that are put out in these are still really relevant today. So the first two principles, the two principles I really want to draw your attention to in relation to population consumption is the first principle. So this, human beings are at the centre of concerns for sustainable development, and that, is really a question of how much are we consuming, or is it really how many there are consuming things. And then the other one is this: to achieve sustainable development and higher quality of life for all people, states should reduce and eliminate unsustainable patterns of production and consumption. So we'll talk about this, and there's a few other videos looking at consumption and how much we consume and how much pressure that puts on the environment, and also how sustainable is the level of that we are consuming. Alright, so just looking into the history a little bit about population and consumption. So Thomas Malthus, he was born 1766 and died 1834. So just to give you a bit of an indication that, in his time he was writing essays around, the principle of population and how we can improve society. long ago, so this isn't really a new issue. And he was really a scholar, and he was widely known for theories about change in population. So he wrote this essay on the principle of population and observed that sooner or later the population would be checked, okay, by famine or disease. And he kind of labelled this Malthusian catastrophe. So this was really in opposition to the popular view around that time, where people saw society as improving, and that, you know, with more people, you know, population growth was going to be good, and that they were going to progress towards this utopian society where, you know, this society would be, you know, the more the population, the greater the power, and, you know, the more healthier we would be. So he was quite controversial in his time, saying that, you know, eventually that there was dangers in population growth, and that it was going to have a negative consequence to human health and also on the environment. So, you know, he was kind of saying that the increase of a population is necessarily limited by the means of what was around and the what they had available to them to be able to survive. So, you know, that the population would be kept in check by famines and things like that. So that's a bit of the history behind population and consumption. So moving on, let's look at the Australian population. So how many people are there in Australia? So these statistics are as current for April 2016. So there's approximately 24 million people living in Australia, and that's you can go on to the ABS, and that link at the bottom of the slides will, you know, you can get, and you can see the population clock and it ticking over and things like that. What's happening here is we're having in Australia about one birth every roughly 2 minutes. We have one death every roughly 3.5 minutes, and this net migration gain, we have one every 2.5 minutes. So that's when people migrate to Australia. So if you add all those together, really what that means is our population is increasing one person every minute and a half. So that's obviously, we're having a population gain. Our growth is constant, and it's happening all the time. So we're actually increasing our population, and that's Australia. And then if we look at other populations or other countries around the world, what we see is you know, most countries are having a gain or a growth in the population. So I really like this image, because this image is just, you know, a representation of the world's population. So the bigger the writing is, the more people they have in those countries. So you can see here China, India, United States are quite large countries, and then obviously the smaller the word, the smaller their population is. So this was in 2007, so it shouldn't have changed too much. They might have got bigger numbers in that time, but China would still, you know, be one of the biggest populations within the world. Alright, so what this slide now from the UN is indicating is the world's 6 most populous countries, and they really account for half of the global population. So what you can see here now is China in 2013 had 1,386 million people, and then obviously going down. And this cumulative percentage, what that means is China accounts for 19.3% of the total world population, and then when you add in India's population, that adds to 36.8% of the total world population. So these 6 countries actually account for half of the world's population. So you can see these numbers are quite large when you compare to the previous slide looking at Australia's population of 24 million. So we're a lot less in terms of these bigger countries. So when we're looking at population growth, we obviously need to look at fertility rates for countries. So what this slide is, this is from 2014, the UN data. This is looking at fertility by country for the between 2005 and 2010. Fertility really is what's being shown here is the average number of children per woman. So you've got the highest countries here, and their averages are about 7.5 children per woman, and around 6.5, so quite high. And then you've got the lowest countries, so the lowest is 1. If you compare these rates to the Australian fertility rate during the same period, that our rate was 1.8. This figure and these figures are predicted to remain relatively stable. I mean, if you're interested, there are lots of articles around the causes of these higher fertility rates in these countries, but really the biggest factor between the relationship between fertility rates is actually poverty. So higher poverty rates increase fertility rates. So there's actually an interesting video in the YouTube clips that talks about fertility and being one way to make the planet more sustainable, and having a one child kind of not policy, but one child, where it's encouraging that to become the cultural norm, so to speak. So and there's also an article that's looking at the fertility and how it's portrayed in science around population issues and environmental issues. Alright, so this graph from the UN in 2013, this is looking at the projections and variance of the population growth. So what we see here now is the blue line is the medium, what we're expecting. So you can see from the 1950s to 2090, we're going to see an increase in the population. And then there's this purple line at the top that looks at if there's a constant increase in fertility, or if there's just a high, or if there's a low. So what you can see is there's still going to be an increase in the population. But I think this graph really just is demonstrating to you the small differences in the trajectory of the population, that fertility during these decades, just a small change in different fertility rates is going to have a major consequence for population size and structure and distribution in the long run. So that high line, so that purple line, is an example, and this is assuming that an extra half of a child, so 0.5 of a child per woman on average will be born, and that's going to increase the population, from 2.5 billion in 1950 to around 25 billion by 2090 if the fertility rates increase by only 0.5 of a baby per woman. And if you compare that to the medium variant, there's going to be, a big difference between 25 million and 25 billion compared to 16.6 billion. And the low variant, so this green line, if we do see that little bit of a downward slope, that would be if women were to have 0.5 less of a child, the fertility rates dropped worldwide by 0.5. So you can just see how 0.5 of a child, either an increase per woman compared to a decrease per woman, can have such a large influence on the population growth of the world. So I think that's the important thing to take away, that the population growth is highly dependent on very minimal changes in fertility rates. Alright, so this graph is just looking at the world fertility and the life expectancy. So what we can see now is fertility at a world level was projected to decline from 2.8 children per woman in 1995 to 2000 to about 2 children in 2045 to 2050. So you can see here that's happening. Over the long run, total fertility is projected to settle at around 1.8 children per woman in each country. And what we're expected to see, what we're seeing in this graph here is the fertility rate is declining, but life expectancy is increasing. So when we talk about life expectancy is done by a country. So that's when a person's born, they're expected to live to X amount of years. It's not, obviously it's done on a country average rather than, per person, but that's roughly. So what we're seeing here is there's less babies being born, but people are living longer. So we're slowing the population growth, but we're still at the same time people are living longer, so the population's still staying quite large. So really we've spoken briefly about population and looking at population, but the question then is the issue population growth or is the issue overpopulation? So is there too many people or is it how quickly we're growing? So really when thinking about that question is we've got to look at the carrying capacity. So carrying capacity doesn't just refer to humans, it also refers to animals, any kind of species. And the carrying capacity is, what it's referring to is it's the capacity of an environment. So it's what is the maximum population size of a species that the environment can sustain indefinitely, given the food, habitat, water supply and other necessities available in the environment that's needed for living. So there's a certain limit so that we can live at, and that's that carrying capacity. And if you actually read articles around population growth, a lot of the articles say that they all agree that we're about to breach the carrying capacity of our planet. So we're over using resources. Is that, is it because we're consuming too much, or is it because there's too many people in the world? So really, that's the biggest issue, is what is this carrying capacity? What's happening at this carrying capacity level? And then if we think about it, exponential growth, where there's a lot of growth happening very quickly. And, this is quite common if we look at animal. There's a tendency in animal populations. And normally what happens with exponential growth is it's normally constrained in animal populations with things like limited food supplies, predators, infectious diseases, changes in the reproductive behaviour that are dependent on density. And what we're seeing obviously in humans is that there's less predators for us, compared to hunter-gatherers' time. Food supplies aren't as limited anymore. So we're going through this exponential growth. So I guess then you've got to look at, when this is happening, well, what's happening at these other levels? The two kind of key terms that we're looking at here is this local crisis. And this occurs when numbers increase beyond the carrying capacity of the environment. So obviously, what's happening here is population numbers have breached carrying capacity, and what we see then is there's crises so there's food shortages, so then a lot of people, there's famines, and that can increase death rates, and then brings it back to a population level that fits with the carrying capacity. So we've seen this in famines around the world. An example is the Chinese famine in 1959 and 1961. But what this McMichael and Powers actually suggests is that that's actually not got anything to do with the amount of food that we can produce, but maybe more about economic mismanagement. So if you're interested in that, read this article. There's a reference at the end of these slides around that. The other concept is this planetary overload, and that's, you watched a clip on that earlier in the semester, so I won't go over that too much. Okay, so then spoken about population, people numbers getting larger. And what we're starting to see is that that economies and societies are needing to rapidly grow to meet the global population, and that what's happening now is that these current patterns of consumption that we have in production actually are breaching these boundaries. So this is leading to economic crisis, social unrest, natural disasters, and that's all affecting how sustainable the development is. So now we're going to talk about let's look at more consumption and how that's impacting on the environment. So this is looking at how much, and I guess this is a measure on looking at a measure that we can use to compare countries and between different years about how much we're consuming. So this is household expenditure per capita. So this is per person, how much is being spent at a household level. And this is what we're seeing here, the dollar amount is all consistent with 2005 US dollars, so that we can compare from the 1960s to 2012, and this is all the available data. And if you look here, Australia went in the 1960s to spending about $7,480 per capita. We're now up to about $21,000 per capita, so that's quite a large jump. But what you can see here is if you compare it to the world population, we're actually 4 times the world average of what we consume. You can see United States, United Kingdom, Australia, we actually consume a lot. That's a little bit worrying when you look at China, which has a large population, they're actually below the world average. So this is a really good demonstration of the patterns of consumption. So Australia, United Kingdom, United States is quite high in consumption. And there's a few other videos looking at consumption rates after this lecture that you can watch on YouTube in the playlist. This graph, what it's showing here is that it's showing that I think it really demonstrates that the world's richest, so the 20% of the world's richest people consume about 80% of consume 80% of consumption of things like food, water, electricity, things like this, where the world's poorest 20% consume about 1.5%. So what we see here is there's not very much per people, but they're consuming a lot more than all the other people in the world. So that's looking at consumption. Maybe population isn't the issue, maybe overconsumption is the issue. So really, if you think about it, the richest 20, 86% of the consumption, the richest 20% of the population, world population, consume 58% of the world's energy, 45% of the meat and fish, 84% of the paper, 87% of the cars, 74% of the telephones. So what's happening here is there's overconsumption in the richest 20% of the population. And just to finish up, looking at a few other stats that show consumption rates. You might have seen this earlier in the semester when we were looking at water. But what I want to really just point out here is this water withdrawal per capita. So this is how much water we're using per person. So the population density, so looking at that, so you can see here Australia and the US is actually using a lot more water than some other countries. So again, there's that overconsumption of water. How much water are you using per country? So really, hopefully after watching this lecture, you get a bit of an insight into population and consumption. Now what follows is there are a couple of videos that look at some of the key themes of this week. There's actually one that, one of my favourites is this magic of the washing machine that looks at consumption in the richest 20% of the population. So have a look at those videos, and there's also an article to read around fertility rates and talking about that within research. So hopefully after reading that and having a bit of a discussion, it gets you to start thinking about consumption and population rates and things like that. So thank you.